Burglar trainer class is an interesting one. You really only encounter them in the Cinnabar Mansion, and all of their Pokemon are fire types, as if they were caught right there in the mansion. If your water and your ground types aren't up to snuff yet, then the Burglar can serve as a good warm-up for Blaine. Yes, that's a fire pun. Just looking at the 6 Burglars that we meet in the mansion, it's pretty easy to figure out which Pokemon we're going to be using for a Burglar theme deck. We're going to be using all of these Pokemon except for Growlithe. We did already see Charmeleon in the Pokemaniac deck, and I tried to avoid overlap like that, but Ninetales and Charmeleon have very similar uses, and so it just made sense to use them together, especially for the Burglar. Alright, let's get burgly with this deck list. A little fun extra tidbit here is that I filmed this footage while the sun was setting, and so as the video progresses, the shadows get longer and longer, and you can actually see the shadow of my camera tripod like creep up from the bottom of the screen slowly. Starting out with a playset of Ponyta, it is pretty fragile with only 40 HP, especially since both of its attacks require 2 energy. So most of the time it's just going to be an early game starter that you're going to retreat to the bench or just let get knocked out so that you can set up a Charmeleon or a Ninetales on your bench. There are no double colorless in this deck, so you can't really get off a turn 1 kick. But it also does help balance out the deck a little bit, as Charmeleon and Ninetales attacks are pretty hefty for this limited format, especially if you're going against other decks in the format like Bugcatcher. We've got a full playset of Charmander and then 3 copies of Charmeleon. That flamethrower attack is probably going to be your go-to for this deck. That's the first thing you want to get set up. Get into that flamethrower cycle as quickly as possible, where it's just use flamethrower, discard an energy. Next turn, attach an energy, use flamethrower, discard an energy. Ninetales is similar, but will require a lot more setup, but for a bigger bang. So we got 3 copies of Vulpix and 2 copies of Ninetales. Ninetales does have a 2 energy attack in Lure, which is basically Gust of Wind. That way, if you're not completely set up for a Fire Blast yet, you can maybe stall for a turn by using Lure, pulling out something that your opponent can't easily get back onto the bench unless they have a switch in hand. But if you do manage to get those 4 energy onto Ninetales, Fire Blast is going to be an OHKO for the majority of basic Pokemon and Stage 1s, a lot of Stage 2s in this mini format. So as far as energy efficiency goes, Charmeleon is the better choice, but that 50 damage is going to fall short of some OHKOs without the help of some plus powers, and so in that regard, Ninetales is better in that it can actually get some OHKOs. For trainer support in this fire deck, we got a full playset of Bill and 2 copies of Computer Search. No Oak this time around because you don't want to be discarding fire energy from your hand just for draw power. Rely on those 4 Bills. In playtesting these trainer class decks against one another, I found that I usually only use 1 Oak per game anyway. Typically, I could get everything I needed for a solid setup just with Bill, Computer Search, and then a couple of other cards depending on the trainer class build. For this one, got 2 copies of Pokemon Trader because there are multiple evolution lines, and a lot of times you'll get a Ponyta in your hand and just go, it's a little too late in the game for this, why don't I trade this up for a Ninetales or a Charmeleon? 2 copies of Item Finder, which will most often probably be used to recycle last, which also has 2 copies in this deck. It could probably use another one because you don't want to get energy removal. Because Charmeleon needs 3 energy, Ninetales needs 4 energy, you don't want to get hit with multiple energy removals from your opponent. Last is a great way to just get all of those out of your opponent's hand, that way you don't have to worry about them next turn. Couple copies of Switch and then 3 copies of Gust of Wind, because you want to make sure if you're having to discard energy that you've built up on a Charmeleon or a Ninetales, that you're going to deal some good damage with it, that you're going to hopefully get a knockout with it. That's where Gust of Wind comes in, pulling out those weaker Pokemon or Pokemon that aren't completely set up yet. That way you can attack them freely, get them easy kills. Be using a full playset of energy removal too, so you can pull out a Pokemon that's got a high retreat cost. Just hit it with some energy removals. That way it's really hard for your opponent to get back on the bench. That's another great way to stall. Just make sure that when you're about to use last, that you've already used all the energy removals from your hand, even if maybe it wasn't the greatest time for it. You just don't want them sent back into your deck when you could use them right away. 3 copies of energy retrieval to get those fire energy back out of your discard, back into your hand. That way you can just keep recycling them. Get a little visit by Cat Burglar Charles, casting a shadow. And then of course a full playset of plus power, because this is base fossil. Why would you build a deck without a full playset of plus power? And then the rest of the deck will be filled out with fire energy, because you're going to need a lot of them, considering you should expect for at least 3 of them to get discarded by your opponent's energy removals. Even if you're proactive with last, they're still going to get them out of their deck and they're still going to use them on you. And then you also need to account for all the energy you'll be discarding with Flamethrower and Fire Blast in between your available uses of energy retrieval to try to get those back into your hand. Overall, it's a very straightforward deck. Like I said earlier, you just get into that Flamethrower cycle of attach, attack, discard, next turn, do the same until Charmeleon is gone. Or Ninetales. Against other trainer classes, the Burglar has some pretty good matchups, aside from Beauty, because this deck is very scared of turn 2 Seaking. The main weak point is Ponyta's low HP, so if you do want to remedy that while still staying within the confines of the trainer class, replace it with Growlithe, which has 60 HP, still requires 2 energy to attack, but it's gonna be a much safer bet early game. Alternatively, you could expand the Burglar's pool of Pokemon by including Rapidash as well. Rapidash is a great card. Highly underappreciated in my opinion. It's a defensive fire type with free retreat. Having Rapidash and Charmeleon in the same deck might make it a little too good, but it's completely up to you on how you would like to represent the Burglar, as this is just a role-playing format basically. But here's my gripe with these Stage 1 fire types. They all have a first attack that can utilize double colorless energy and really speed up the deck, add some variety to it, but their secondary attacks make it counterproductive to use double colorless energy. So really, all 3 of these Stage 1 fire types are only good for their 3 or 4 energy attacks, unless you're just splashing in a Charmeleon or a Rapidash into a deck for some coverage. And so that's another weakness in this deck, is that it's slow. It's a very slow setup trying to get 3 energy attached to a Charmeleon just before you can attack. Even more so for Ninetales, and so your early game is going to be a whole lot of stalling and sacrificing, but mid to late game it's definitely worth it because the damage output for Charmeleon and Ninetales is pretty huge. One additional strategy you could implement is including Pokeflute in this deck, so that you can return some weak Pokemon from your opponent's discard back to their bench, and then use Ninetales Lure to pull them into the active position. Just some bench manipulation shenanigans to help stall out while you're fully powering up Ninetales. But sometimes playing Pokeflute actually just helps out your opponent more than it hurts them, and so that's why I didn't include it in this build. And that is another trainer class theme deck down, the Burglar. So let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Check out all my social media links down in the description, and until next video, bye-bye.